right, I think I am going to get started with our program since so many of you are here and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So good evening and welcome to the Lake County History Symposium. My name is Sarah Salto and I am a museum educator with the Best Dunn Museum of Lake County, which is part of the Lake County Forest Preserves. Thank you for joining us for this first half of the 8th annual Lake County History Symposium. This year's theme is Eat, Drink, and Be Merry, the history of food and hospitality in Lake County. This focuses on family cookbooks, development of well-known restaurants, and stories of communities holding unique banquets. So tonight we have 3 presentations that you will be able to hear. Each presentation will be about 20 to 30 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions at the end of each presentation. The topics tonight include an 1895 family cookbook, a Highland Park Community Cookbook, and the Rustic Manor restaurant. This evening's program is graciously sponsored by USG, which makes this program free for all of you to attend. USG also sponsors free admission to the museum every first and third Thursday evening of the month. So it's a great opportunity to come visit the museum if you've never had the chance. And just as a reminder, the History Symposium will continue at the next USG Thursday night, so the 3rd evening of the month, which is January 19th, and we'll have 3 new presentations on that evening. And I will put a link to that in the chat if you are interested in joining us for the second half of the Lake County History Symposium. Before we do begin our program, I want to encourage everyone to visit the Dunn Museum, which is located in Libertyville. The Dunn Museum features permanent exhibits from the Lake County history and is organized chronologically, so it covers everything from prehistoric times to present day. In addition to the museum, we also have virtual exhibits, so if you can't make it on one of our open hours, you can still learn more about our collections and our history online. And we also have a YouTube page. So I am also going to put the links in the chat and we can post those again later if you're curious to learn more about the Dunn Museum and the programs and opportunities we have to engage in local history. With all that kind of good stuff out of the way, I would now like to officially start our program on the Lake County History Symposium. The Lake County History Symposium brings together those interested in actively researching the history of Lake County, Illinois. The goal of this program is to share and present original research done by professional, amateur, and student historians to provide a deeper understanding of local history and recognize its significance in a broader context. We hope tonight you learn more about Lake County history and find new opportunities to visit local historical sites. So again, with all that out of the way, I want to bring on our first presenter. Our first presentation of the evening is Not Done Yet, examining Mary Ethel Crofton's 1895 cookbook used at Fort Sheridan. The presenter is Nicole Stocker. Nicole has worked as a museum educator with the Lake County Forest Preserves and its Best Dunn Museum of Lake County since 2009.
Dad, how come this isn't working?
So she is my co-worker. Thank you. And Nicole has received a BA in History, a BA in Anthropology, and Secondary Education certification from the University of Michigan. She also has an MA in Public History from Loyola University, Chicago. As part of her current role, she helps to lead interpretation at several historic sites, including Fort Sheridan, which her talk focuses on today. So thank you, Nicole, for being willing to join us tonight.
Thanks, Sarah. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's exciting to have you all here tonight. And so my talk tonight is focusing on something having to do with Fort Sheridan, as Sarah mentioned. And during the past few years, I've worked with our collection staff at the Best Dunn Museum to research and interpret an item donated to us more recently in 2019. This handwritten cookbook that you see here was made and used at Fort Sheridan, and the first page states Mary Ethel Crofton, Fort Sheridan, November 1895. Mary Ethel Crofton was the daughter of Gabrielle Josephine Shubrick Crofton and Colonel Robert Erskine Anderson Crofton, who was the colonel of the 15th Infantry and commander of troops at Fort Sheridan from January of 1891 until October of 1896. So today, 250 acres at Fort Sheridan are part of the Lake County Forest Preserves, as is the Bessbauer Dunn Museum. And the U.S. Army post at Fort Sheridan was in operation from 1887 until 1993. And when the fort closed, part of the land was donated to the Lake County Forest Preserves. And you can go see that today. Some of you may have already been there. A beautiful site. And there was a museum at the site that also closed. And when it did, our staff worked to acquire a vast array of collections items, including dozens of artifacts and nearly 3,000 photographs and postcards dating from the 1890s to the 1980s. Permission for this transfer was granted by the U.S. Center for Military History in Washington, D.C., and many of these items have actually been digitized and can be viewed on the Illinois Digital Archives website. And we'll share that link later on. Since then, we have continued to expand the related collection and our collection as a whole. And the Crofton Cookbook then is part of that. Fort Sheridan actually began as a result of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And by 1870, Chicago was quickly becoming the commercial and railroad hub of the nation, with a little over 300,000 people. On October 8th through the 10th of 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed roughly 3.3 square miles of the city and left around 100,000 people homeless, or a third of the population. Mayor Roswell Mason declared martial law, and General Philip Sheridan's troops with the Division of the Missouri were brought in. The troops built temporary shelters for victims of the fire and restored order. However, unrest continued in the city with labor strikes, including the railroad strike of 1877 and the Haymarket tragedy of 1886. Influential businessmen in Chicago, who were members of a group called the Commercial Club, feared the growing reality of a working class revolution in the city and discussed the possibility of the government establishing a military post near the city to permanently maintain order. Philip Sheridan was also a member of this club, and he, along with others, advised purchasing around 600 acres near Highwood, which was done. Lakefront property was and continues to be of high value around the area, but this particular spot was unappealing as it had been damaged. In the 1840s until approximately 1865, the village of St. John's was located at the site. And members of the village would harvest clay deposited along the bluffs in the area and would make around 400,000 bricks annually. This work damaged the site, but this did not deter the Army. And here you can see some different images of those bluffs. Brigadier General Samuel E. Halliburd, Quartermaster General of the Army, awarded the commission for designing the fort to the firm of Halliburd and Roche, today Halliburd and Root. If you haven't noticed, his son's firm. The firm designed 66 buildings at the fort, including the iconic water tower. These buildings were constructed between 1889 and 1895 out of an estimated 6 million bricks made on site out of clay, also mined from the bluffs. Halliburd and Roche also worked with nationally recognized landscape architect O.C. Simons in the design and layout of the site. And Simons tried to preserve a lot of the natural elements of the site in his layout. He also chose the spot for the parade grounds that you can see there. The first troops arrived from Fort Douglas, Utah by rail in 1887 and camped in tents on those very parade grounds. And the first cavalry troops, the 7th Cavalry, arrived in 1892. It was first called Camp at Highwood, but was given the name Fort Sheridan in 1888, signed into existence by the commander-in-chief of the Army at the time, none other than Philip Sheridan himself. Now, Colonel Crofton's military career began during the American Civil War when he enlisted on May 14th of 1861. He then rose up the ranks, gaining notoriety for his service, particularly during the battles of Shiloh, Chickamauga, and Mission Ridge. And after the war, he was stationed in the western part of the United States and became a colonel on October 19th of 1886, commanding the 16th Infantry at Fort Buford, North Dakota, until January 28th of 1891. He married Gabrielle Josephine Shubrick on January 7th of 1864, and Gabrielle stems from prominent French-American relatives, including the founders of the DuPont Company. Together, they had 6 children, which you can see listed here, including the last, Mary Ethel, who our cookbook focuses on. So Colonel Crofton then took command at Fort Sheridan as the 4th post commandant in January of 1891. And here you can see an image of the officer's residence loop around 1890. He and his family would have lived in this loop at 111 in building number 9, the post commandant's quarters. And here you can see the historic district and that house. Both Building 9 and Building 8 sit at the end of the officer's loop and are right on Lake Michigan. And these buildings were completed in 1890, just a year prior to the Crofton family's occupancy. They're also designed a little differently from some of the other buildings at the fort, as they are designed in the Queen Anne style. So these 2 buildings were designed to stand apart from the rest of the homes in the officer's loop and the rest of the post, and were considered unusually luxurious for military housing at the time, as you can see. Colonel Crofton was in charge at Fort Sheridan during the only test of the fort's true mission, which was to keep the peace in the city of Chicago when President Cleveland ordered troops into the city to establish law and order during the Pullman strike of May to July 1894. Just after assuming command at the fort, too, he was also involved in another significant and complex chapter of the fort's history. A group of 19 Sioux warriors had been brought to the fort after the battles at Wounded Knee in South Dakota in December of 1890. Some of the warriors did not return to South Dakota until summer of 1891. And many actually ended up joining Buffalo Bill Cody on a tour through Europe. But here you can see a letter dated March 13th of 1891. And this is from General Miles, commander of the Division of the Missouri, who had led the Sioux to the fort initially. And this is written to Colonel Crofton regarding Cody and allowing him the opportunity to speak with the native people, stating that they had permission from the Army to join Cody, granted they wanted to go. Troops from Fort Sheridan were again sent down to Chicago during the World's Fair of 1893, again connecting the Croftons to this area during an extremely significant period of time. Tragically, Gabrielle Josephine Shubrick Crofton passed away at the fort in December of 1894 of apoplexy. She was 60 years old. She was transported back to her hometown of Wilmington, Delaware by train, and her funeral and burial took place there. Colonel Crofton appears to have taken a leave of absence from December of 1894 until April of 1895, as Colonel Samuel Ovenshine is listed as being in command during this period. With her death, their daughters, still stationed at the fort with their father, would potentially have taken on the role of hostess or hostesses of the post commandant's quarters for the remaining roughly year and a half that Colonel Crofton served as post commandant until October of 1896. Mary Ethel Crofton then perhaps took on some of those duties with the kitchen, with the cookbook, and perhaps it served as a way to remember and commemorate her mother as well, and we'll discuss this more a little later. So again, with this cookbook, the first page notes, Mary Ethel Crofton, Fort Sheridan, November 1895. The cookbook is only about a fourth of the way filled, and it contains mainly recipes for breads and desserts, though there are a few exceptions to that, as you can see here, with the full list of recipes included. And I decided to work to transcribe this over the past few years and test out some of the recipes. Many of the recipes are credited to various individuals and/or forts, though the last 4 are actually credited to the Washington Post, which is interesting. So after listing out all the recipes in this cookbook of Mary's, I decided to start with one that appeared somewhat familiar, which was for soft ginger cookies. And trying to replicate this recipe, I tried to follow the instructions as best I could and not to use too many newer pieces of equipment in completing this as well. So for this particular recipe, I years ago had found my great-grandmother's recipe for molasses cookies and have been making those every Christmas since. And in comparing these 2 recipes, they had a lot of similarities, which helped me fill in any missing gaps from Mary's recipe in the book. And some of those missing parts included in a time and temperature, right, for baking with today's equipment, and also an estimated amount of flour, as she states, then just add flour enough to make a light dough. So the other part of this was that you had to beat it well for 10 minutes, and I actually did that mixing by hand. When completing this recipe, this actually turned out pretty well. And this, I ended up filming myself too, and this video launched a new endeavor, which you can check out on the YouTube page that Sarah mentioned before. We have a series called Not Done Yet, Old Recipes, New Bakers, and it features several recipes from this cookbook. So I tested out quite a few over time, trying to figure out how to fill in missing gaps with historic recipes and different measurements that were included in the book. And here you can see the soft ginger cookies. They actually turned out pretty good overall. Next, I tried a recipe for hominy bread. And this one was a little more straightforward with some of the ingredients. But you can see I kind of played around with any missing notes and with baking time and temperature. But then my third recipe was one that did not go so well. We'll see in a moment. So there's the hominy bread. Parker House rolls was my first failure and continues to be my nemesis. This recipe is listed to take a day and a half to make. It includes 1 teacup of homemade yeast. And then my favorite measurement in the cookbook, which appears multiple times, which is butter the size of an egg. So trying to mix all this and figure this out, you have to put it in a cool place at 10 p.m. at night. And at 10 a.m. the next morning, you're supposed to mix it all together and knead, and then put it back in a cool place until 4 p.m. to then cut it into rolls and bake. So this recipe continues to elude me because if you know Parker House rolls, they're supposed to turn out to be buttery, delicious rolls, not the flat tacos that I ended up making here. And I tried a couple different kinds of yeast, including homemade sourdough yeast, and that still didn't quite work. So if anyone wants to attempt this recipe, on our YouTube page, we do list the original recipe with a photo and any notes that I have, as well as that recipe transcribed. And you can give it a shot and let me know. Some other ones that I tried, one of my most delicious recipes included in here, and one that I decided to try too because at the museum we have Bessbauer Dunn's diaries, and she notes making a caramel cake in one of her entries. So I decided to try this one, and this turned out to be one of the most delicious. It basically tastes like a cake version of a Twix bar. And then some other ones I tried to do too included Scotch cakes, which actually turned out pretty well. A little more straightforward recipe. And raspberry ice, which partly I decided to choose because I remembered the Mary Poppins song that mentions it. So just sounded fun. And it was very bright, a little messy, but pretty tasty. So in trying these different different recipes and making these videos, This was quite a challenge to overcome. I'm not new to baking and definitely enjoy my baking shows, but I was and am still a novice at historic baking. It's one thing to try to read the handwriting and get the recipe correct, but it's then a whole other process to try to fill in those missing pieces to adapt it for today, and the different equipment that we have now to be able to cook with. So I actually had contacted Catherine Lambrecht, who will speak in a little bit, to get some advice on this when I started out and to collaborate on some different programs, which helped us both to figure out how to test out some new recipes, discuss successes, failures, and questions, and invite participants of those programs to do the same. And some of the recipes Kathy tested out actually had some relation to the Ossoli cookbooks, which she'll discuss in a little bit. So again, you can find those on our YouTube page. The other thing is, though, that we actually have 2 Crofton cookbooks in our collection. And one of the others is from Gabrielle Josephine Schubert Crofton. And hers actually states in the cover, Gabrielle J.S. Crofton, Fort Buford, Dakota, May 2nd, 1887. So hers is even older. And this cookbook actually contains many more recipes in what appear to be various handwriting and sections that are mixed together from different notebooks or sets of papers. It even has newspaper clippings in it, inserted or glued in. And this one here in the center, if you can see my cursor, this one actually goes through and notes different measurements, like my favorite, the butter the size of an egg, and what that might equate to. This seems more like a working recipe book with tons of recipes acquired and thrown in, as well as stains on the pages, perhaps from use. And though she marked it 1887 on one page, there are recipes that are noted as being older, like one here from 1871, which you can see noted just above the Dunn Museum logo. There's also other forts that are noted, providing a view into their life as a traveling military family, and perhaps sharing recipes directly with other women and families while stationed at each location, or passed among families to each other as they moved and interacted. In working to compare the recipes included, I also noticed that there are quite a few similar to the ones in Mary's cookbook, including the recipe for caramel cake. Studying both, they appear to be the same recipe and credited to the same Mrs. Wheeler. The handwriting is similar to the page where Gabrielle signed her name, so currently I believe she wrote this particular recipe in the book. And here is a recipe even on the next page for my nemesis Parker House rolls. Again, the same as in Mary's cookbook. It appears that Mary was going through her mother's cookbook and selecting recipes for her own, as many are matching so far. So this cookbook is quite interesting because it provides a lot of information. And trying to do some more research on the family now too, to see if we can learn some more from diaries of one of the daughters that was also stationed at the fort. And we're also in touch with descendants of Mary Ethel Crofton to learn more about them too. But here we began by utilizing the cookbook in the way it was intended, as a cookbook. And through that work of examining the recipes and delving into Mary and her family, we're able to tell a completely unique story related to Fort Sheridan. That of the family station there, the women at the site, and the early years of the establishment of the fort. Fort Sheridan's history covers such a large time span and a very complex array of people and events. And with this, we're able to tell a more closely examined story of a life for a family at the fort at a moment in time. This one family also connects so many stories of the Chicago area into one experience and highlights life for often underrepresented stories here of military families and women of that time period. These recipes also provide insight into family or personal cookbooks and ingredients and cooking methods at that time period. Preserves a lot of knowledge that may have been lost otherwise, as many historic recipes are not recorded, as the cook often knew them by memory, many examples of that in my own family, and often only recipes made occasionally or for special occasions would then be written down. Cookbooks, especially handwritten ones like these, are very personal items too, and important in showcasing family traditions, family history, and providing a more in-depth look at daily life. And food and recipes unite us in so many ways, and people connect certain foods or recipes with fond memories of childhood and important individuals in their lives who cooked these recipes, social events and functions, and more. And this then is a great way to connect history to all of us, and we get the benefit then of continuing to expand our research skills and our taste buds with testing out these different recipes. So we'll see if we keep going. But thank you.
All right, so if anyone has any questions for Nicole, please put them in the chat, and we already have one. So Nicole, this is kind of a question that I was going to ask too, so might expand on it a little bit, but where would they buy cooking ingredients? And then my question was also along ingredients. Were there ones that you like immediately recognized, or were there ones that you didn't recognize? And thirdly, were there like, I know Kathy was kind of mentioning this before, but were there like brand name ones either too that you
in terms of the ingredients?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So to go for the first question, you know, in buying cooking ingredients, I'm sure there were a lot of local places that they could go at that time, and that the Army would have set up as well for supplies for food for the entire base. But if you think about this cookbook being the post commandant's daughters, these are recipes that most likely would have been used in that house with either higher ranked officials at that time, higher ranked people in the area, visitors to the fort. So this would be a little different than the kitchen that would have fed a lot of the other individuals stationed there. So some of this could have been sourced, I would assume, from local farms, but also from just local stores at that time period, because there were different general stores around the area even then. In terms of the notes of the ingredients, they don't really mention any specific brands that I've noticed. And in looking through, they really just talk about more general ingredients. And then for some of it too, you know, it can vary a little bit depending on, in the mother's cookbook, all the different handwriting. I'm still trying to sort through it in a lot of ways, because some of it, as you saw, is really tight script and a little harder to read. So maybe in there, they'll have a little more clues as to some of those details. And then did I miss one of your questions, Sarah? Was that?
Nope, I think you got it.
Okay.
So the next question is the recipe available or scanned on the Illinois Digital website? And do you have any other maybe primary sources that you used for your research?
Sure. So it has not been scanned. That has not been a project just yet, since it is a newer piece to the Dunn Museum's collection. I did go through and we photographed the different pages, and we've started to transcribe a lot of the recipes. So that was a first step. And then, you know, maybe at some point that will be available. Right now, though, any of the recipes that have videos on our YouTube channel, I did upload a photo of the recipe page from the cookbook, as well as the transcription and my notes for how I interpreted any missing details, cooking time, temperature, other ingredients like that. Yeah. So we'll see what happens with more of it in the future, because there's a lot more to transcribe and test out.
So this will be our last question for Nicole now. And then again, we'll have a breakout session at the end of all three presentations where you can continue to ask Nicole her questions or talk to her about her Parker rules if you have a way to improve on them. I saw that in the chat too. So the last question is about how many recipes are in the book, and is there an accessible copy of the book? Maybe you can show with your hands how thick it is.
Yeah, so the recipe book itself is not very thick, and it's about a fourth of the way filled. So it's not even halfway full of recipes. So it looks like it was a work in progress, maybe, or as much as she wanted to complete at that time. I could count how many recipes and get back to you guys at the end, because I did list them all out on that one slide. There are quite a few. And again, they're mostly desserts and breads, which, would maybe make more sense for recipes that weren't memorized and were written down. So I hope that answers it. And yes, when we do the breakout sessions, if anyone I see the notes about the Parker house rules, please talk to me. We'll figure it out.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. I always enjoy hearing about the cookbook. So we're going to transition to our next presenter. So our next presenter is our presentation. Actually, I should start off with the title of the presentation is Highland Park Community Cookbooks, circa 1911 and 1925 by Catherine Lambrecht, who Nicole already introduced a little bit as she helped Nicole with the other cookbook. Catherine is a veteran of culinary competitions at the Lake County and Illinois State Fair, a former University of Illinois Extension volunteer whose specialties were Master Food Preserver and Master Gardener, and a founder of a Greater Midwest Foodways Alliance, Chicago Foodways Roundtable, which is a sister organization of Culinary Historians of Chicago, and the LTHforum.com, a Chicago culinary chat site. The Illinois Rhodes Scholar for Illinois Humanities. She's a current one too, so if you like her talk, feel free to book her on the Illinois Humanities website. That's a great resource. But there she's talking on history of American pies and Illinois' well-represented and family heirloom recipes from the Illinois State Fair. Catherine is also a program director for the Highland Park Historical Society and the Illinois Mycological Association, or as she calls it, her Mushroom Club. Right. And she's also the editor of Heirloom Recipes from the Illinois State Fair, a bicentennial project. For Catherine, a day spent well is when she learns something new. So thank you, Kathy, for being here, and we'll turn it over to you for our next cookbook chat.
I have to really give credit to Nancy Webster, who's the archivist for the Highland Park Historical Society, for nudging me into doing this. We have been aware for many years of the Ossoli Cookbook Club. We happen to not own a copy, but the University of Illinois Champaign does. And she said, why don't you do that as a talk? And I was like, okay. But a week before I was supposed to do that talk, the book on the right, the Highland Park Women's Club Cookbook from 1925, popped up out of our, things to do kind of thing. And it made a lot of sense to compare these two cookbooks. The Ossoli Club Cookbook is from 1911, 1912. The Highland Park Women's Club Cookbook is from 1925. And they're roughly from the same organization. So if you were a member of the Highland Park Club, you could be a member of the Ossoli Club, but you couldn't be a member of the Ossoli Club without being a member of the Highland Park Club. And then the Highland Park Women's Club was a little bit more open and has its roots a little bit slightly different, but there's a big overlap, big overlap between the two. And let's see. Sorry. Okay. The two community cookbooks had service as their fundraiser. And so the Ossoli Cookbook was to raise money for the first public bathing beach in Highland Park. And this was something that they raised the money for. They built buildings. They had they were educating people on swimming. Eventually it was turned over to the Park District, but nonetheless, they were the ones that got the thing going. The Women's Club Cookbook from 1925 built or contributed toward building this building that's on Sheridan Road and Elm Place in Highland Park. And these community cookbooks have their roots in the Civil War. Women raised money to buy bandages. They rolled them, sent it to the front. And after the war was over, they kind of liked that entrepreneurial spirit and carried it on through this good deeds. Both books have, these are what they call an index. I would call them chapter titles. In fact, I created my own index of both of these books to make this even workable. The one on the left, the Ossoli Cookbook, it says index, but one item just flows from the other, whereas the index on the right, at least there was a chapter ending and you went to the next one, whereas the other one, it was a blend. And it took an army of women to make these books happen. So the Ossoli Cookbook from 1911, 1912, it was 130 different people involved. For the Highland Park Women's Club, and by the way, it's 130 people, 653 recipes, of which 250 were not attributed. For the Highland Park Cookbook Club, there was 184 people involved, 445 recipes. And like everything else, there's the prolific contributors, which I sincerely think are probably the people who were involved in making this happen, because those of us who have contributed to these kinds of efforts usually end up, there's not quite enough recipes, so you start digging through your personal collection. The one interesting exception was in the Ossoli Cookbook Club, there was one woman. Every recipe that she had, she attributed to somebody else. Everybody else attributed the recipes to themselves. And there were 3 contributors to both cookbooks. There, you can see that at the bottom of the screen. Unfortunately, I have something blocking it, so I can't see it. And these are effectively, I would say, self-published cookbooks. This is an advertisement of a printer in Highland Park that was in the Highland Park Women's Club, very likely the group who printed it for them. Now, the cookbooks, so here's the way the recipes are kind of laid out. It's much more easy on the eyes, the one from the Highland Park Women's Club. The other one is sort of like a list of ingredients. Sometimes there's details on how to make it, but more often than not, it's just like a list of ingredients and you're expected to have the know-how. There were far fewer in the 1911, 1912 book, canned goods and I would say commercial items specified, far more in the Highland Park book. And these gems, when I was working with Nicole on her book, there were also recipes that referred to gems. And I was like, what is this gem thing all about? And you still see recipes today where they're referred to as gems. And from what I could tell, they all go back to this point. This is the gem manufacturing company who made molds for baking. And I guess they had recipes that were attached and they just sort of got, they roamed around from there. But, you know, you're like, what's this with gem? And it's like, okay, it makes sense once you figure it out. In the Ossoli Cookbook, there were, like I said, there was very little instructions and things like that, but it did have this little guide on how to, you know, for baking, for boiling, measurements. And yes, we also had that lovely situation of, you know, egg the size of a you know, butter the size of an egg, but we also had butter the size of a walnut. And if you really want to have fun, and this is like in the cooking department, ingredients, I would say ingredients by the penny. If you were making a black bean soup, a 15-cent soup bone was needed. But for a vegetable soup, you needed a 10-cent soup bone. Now, maybe there was this issue of different timing and, or is it a different value or just, you know, what have you. Spaghetti and cheese, a 5-cent packet of spaghetti. And for French pickles, if you really want to make them, good luck, because it's 10 cents worth of white mustard, 10 cents of celery seed, and 5 cents of turmeric. Yeah. Can you get that? I don't know. And by the way, can your butcher do this? Calf's head soup. Have the butcher remove the eyes, jawbone, and teeth from the calf's head and crush the bones. And that begins your recipe. So cooking, I felt, in both of these books was far more approachable than the baking. You could kind of suss it out. Granted, with these, ingredients by the penny, well, I guess you just have to kind of imagine, is it by the, well, you'd figure it out. But when it comes to baking, using these older recipes has all sorts of little opportunities for trouble. Now, baking soda was often just soda. Okay, that's easy. But baking powder, that was something that had some very specific issues. In fact, there's a University of Illinois book, The Baking Powder Wars, that touches on this whole issue. But there were Cleveland baking powder mentioned in these things, Dr. Price's cream baking powder, which he happened to live in Waukegan, and he had a son who lived in Highland Park, and he had a grandson named Vincent. I think we've seen a few movies by him. There's also the Royal baking powder. Then there was the do-it-yourself baking soda and cream of tartar or sour milk or buttermilk. The thing with the baking powders of that era was they were all different formulas and they behaved differently. They put out little booklets advising you how to use their product. But if you used, let's say, the Cleveland baking powder on a Dr. Price's cream baking powder recipe, it might not work. They were very specific. And even early versions of the Joy of Cooking would refer to two different kinds of baking powder, single and double acting, so there you go. And yeast, you have cake yeast, you have yeast powder, you have the teacup of yeast, the frothy yeast, which I learned about at the Route Museum. In fact, I contacted Nicole and I said, maybe this is what they're talking about. We're not sure, but maybe. And there's another yeast at the bottom, but I can't read that part of my screen. Sorry about that. But so baking is where you can have lots of fun and get into trouble. But I kind of went the cooking route with some of these recipes. So here's spaghetti and cheese again, 1 5-cent package of spaghetti. Well, all right, this is me cooking at home, and I used what I had. I think I did this during the COVID period. So I had macaronis. So I used macaronis, broken into small pieces. And it had to be in salted water and boiled constantly for 30 minutes. Well, all of us don't believe it's going to take that long. We don't like our macaronis that mushy, but at the same time, I followed the instructions. The only way I could make myself do it was to get it into the pot, make sure it wasn't going to have a boil over, set the timer for 30 minutes, and get out of the kitchen because I want to rescue this. Well, I came back after 30 minutes and the macaronis got kind of large, but they kind of stopped at a certain point when they reached saturation. So it really wasn't as terrible as you would think. They were just a little less texture than what we're used to at this point. And then I put it together as suggested in the recipe. This was a pond lily salad. Now, at the Greater Midwest Foodways, at the Missouri State Fair some years ago, we had another lily salad, not like this, but nonetheless, I felt I needed to give this a shot. And this was a period of time, by the way, where a lot of lettuce leaves were put on the plate and salad dressing, French dressing or mayonnaise with a capital M was poured over things. As you can tell, I made several attempts on how to make it look like a lily with my carving. Maybe not so brilliant, but I could still eat it. How's that? Now, this was a German coffee cake. The Millard family have a log cabin home, or the log cabins to home still exist. I believe it was designed by Boyington. She's not from the family that lived there, but that part of the family, but I'm pretty sure she's part of the Millard family. So this was a German coffee cake. I made it because the connection to the Millards. I also made it because of the X. Now, I suggested that was maybe a rejected recipe, and somebody said perhaps that was a recipe that was liked. I don't know, but it was not terrible. It was good. It was fine. We ate it, which of course is not a high standard because we'll eat anything. Okay, then you have the healthy people who want to interject. So this was turkey with shredded wheat biscuit dressing. And I made it, I didn't put it inside a turkey. I just simply, made it separately. It was fine. It wasn't something that we're like dying to make again. And in fact, my dad's reaction to this particular meal was, this is not really a meal. This is just your cooking experiments, isn't it? But in the Ossoli Cookbook, this is where this recipe came from. In the 1925 cookbook, there was a recipe using the crumbs of shredded wheat. Whatever. And this was baked eggplant. This is what from Mrs. E.B. Pierce, who contributed so many recipes. I wanted to at least make one of them. And this is where she boiled an eggplant, skinned it, mashed it fine, beat it, added some eggs. It was fine. I made it once. I gave the opportunity. It was fine. It was fine. May I put it that way? By the way, I want to also point out there was some, especially today when I was looking at things over and over again, there's a few recipes that I think I'm going to have to make someday just to understand what it is. And one of them was lobster or salmon chops. I have no idea what the outcome will be of that. There was also something called lobster cutlets. Again, no idea. Oyster croquettes, but you didn't have to necessarily use oysters. You could use veal or sweetbreads. Why, of course. And then rice croquettes. Seasoning can be varied by omitting the mace and adding half a teacup of chopped chicken or brains. Well, that's what we all do. And then mock banana, applesauce and eggs. I think I have to put this into the rotation of things to make just to find out what it's all about. Now, this came from the 1925 book. Chop suey was now on the menu. Actually, not too bad. It looks quite similar to one that I made a few years ago when we had Louisa Chu, who's a chop suey fan, do a talk. The mock chop suey, the part I found interesting was an absence of soy sauce, but you I think this is the one, but you had to, or maybe it's the other chop suey, but you had to do a little bit of browning. Like take the sugar and brown it. Yeah, it was the other one. Sugar and brown it to kind of get that caramel, caramel coloring. I don't know what that would be like. Now the arroz con pollo is interesting, especially when they're going to serve it on toast, which I don't think anybody today would do. And it would serve 25 people, and that's from a 5-pound chicken. That's pretty impressive, and probably they had relatively small diets. The fried chicken amused me because here was a person who was, I would say, transitioning, probably had a wood from a gas stove from a wood-fired stove, and pretty much wished they could just work with the wood-fired stove and forget about all these modern things. This book also had something related to leftovers, which the Ossoli book did not. In fact, it was even the leftovers, this nothing soup, which again, I think is just a reworking of leftovers. It had the only wild food, the squirrel pot pie, and then the lemon cups. The reason I put that in was because it was the only recipe that was referring to for motorists, a recipe suitable for motoring, on road trips. Okay, so I indicated I did make this spreadsheet, which is accessible. I'll explain that a little bit. But I did it by page number or what page these recipes were sitting on, so that later on I could, recreate the book. Who the author was, the order that it was in the book. So because once you start to play with spreadsheets and start shifting them back and forth, prioritizing things, you can lose the order very quickly, but I didn't want to do that. The ingredients that were used, like here we got Snyder's oyster cocktail sauce, Durkee's salad dressing. This is from the 1925 book, as I can see. But one of the things I kind of look, every historical society has these books on their shelves, and they're not going very far sitting on the shelves. And there's several things to do. One is this kind of a spreadsheet, and I have available for the Highland, like that list of people who contributed. I have that now on our website. I just put it up at the last day, thankfully, to this talk. But a lot of little details. But this is for the world. This is the Sifter project. There was a lot of press about 2-3 years ago. But this is they're creating a database of old cookbooks, and community cookbooks are very welcome in this project. It was Barbara Ketchum-Whedon's project since the early 1960s when she was working at Harvard. She just started doing these details related to the cookbooks in their collection, and then started broadening it. The Ossoli Cookbook, the Highland Park Women's Cookbook, is in the database. It's not in the detail that they would prefer, but it's a good beginning, because there's a lot about this. I'm still myself learning how to use this and how to input information. And once I understand it well enough, my intention is to teach anybody that wants to do the similar, because I can't do it all, nor can she. So needs all this input. Now, for the Highland Park Historical Society, like I said, just done in the last 2 days. If you go to our homepage, you'll see archives and local history collections, and there will be a tab for Highland Park Community Cookbooks. There's only 2 at the moment. It's the 2 that we're talking about tonight, but I plan to expand it. At the very least, I want to have a spreadsheet similar, index if needed, but really I want to make sure everybody who's contributed a recipe is listed on the website, because when people are doing genealogy, they're looking for family recipes, sometimes these community book contributions might be the recipe they're looking for. So this is when you get to it, you get the look of the cover, and then at the very, this is not the very bottom, there's more detail below, but it indicates where a copy is held, the index that I created, and at both of these locations, at the University of Illinois and the Illinois Digital Archives, are actual page-by-page replications of these books. And so you could actually go and using the index that I have created, which I think I'm going to change the format tomorrow, but don't worry, it's my details. But then you can use the index yourself to find things. Below this that you cannot see is the list of contributors. But I thought that was important. Now, as I said, I believe all of these books have there's people in your community today who contributed to a community cookbook, and perhaps their family doesn't know. But in this one case, the 1925 book, which I did in a pretty, got uploaded pretty quickly from once I knew it was available. But there was a woman, Mary Seafarth, in our community, and she saw me scanning the book and wanted to know what it was about. And I said, it's a cookbook from 1925. And she goes, was my grandmother in it? I was like, did she contribute any recipes? I said, I have no idea. But when I go through Create Index, I will let you know. And this woman, her grandmother, was pretty much a mover and shaker. This woman was on the school board in an era when she couldn't be elected to the school board. She did a lot of good works and unfortunately died young. And this clock was on Lincoln School until recently. It's in storage at the moment. But this clock was designed and put up in her honor after she died. So later that evening, I found these recipes from her grandmother. Of course, they were not attributed to her by her maiden, Nellie Martin Seafarth. It was Mrs. Robert Seafarth, but nonetheless, it was her grandmother. I don't know if the family's made any of this yet, but that's what I could do. So that ends my contribution to this talk. People have any questions, please let me know.
Great, Kathy. There's quite a few questions and comments that have been coming in. One thing that's there's two things that have kind of come up frequently. One is with pricing. Was there anything that shocked you about pricing? Seeing 5-cent package of spaghetti, or was that common pricing back then?
Well, apparently common to them to think that they had.
Yeah.
Let me just turn on and off my video just to see if I can get myself back in focus. Yes, much better, much better. You know what? It was a standard known to everybody at that time. It boggles the mind. I mean, there's a recipe that calls for a half or a whole box of gelatin. Which is it? But in fact, with working with Nicole, I found a parallel recipe for one of her items, and then I was able to work it through. So it's all workable. You just got to go back in time and find out what was a nickel's worth of spaghetti. I'm going to guess it's a pound, but
yeah.
Who knows?
And then I have two more questions for you, and then there's some other comments, but again, we'll have the breakout room, so you can ask Kathy additional questions if we don't get to them now. But similar question to Nicole has been coming through. How have you figured out the sizes? Because someone noted a butter the size of walnuts, or if you figured out the teacup. Nicole also had that teacup size too. I don't know if you can comment on that. Oh
yeah, it's the teacup, it's the coffee cup, it's the demi-tasse. What's nice is there's so many people out there checking out these recipes. There's lots of little tables out there that help you figure it out. But but it's whatever that person's size have, you don't really know, but you at least have a ratio to work with.
Yeah, I think that's obviously the hardest point for anyone to figure out, because you want to be exact with your recipes, especially if you're making something like bread or cake, or
it's the baking that is going to make you unhappy.
Yes.
The cooking, you can kind of jog things around, but with baking, it's chemistry, and you got the formula wrong.
Right. So the last question, and then we'll bring on our last presenter, but this one is, so a lot of these recipes seem more adventurous and affluent for the time period. Do we know if these contributors traveled at all, or where did they get some of their inspiration for the recipes?
Okay, let me give you my general reaction to recipes contributed to family, to community cookbooks. I think some of them are really used, and I think some of them are aspirational, and some of them they want to give you the impression that they used it and they never have. I mean, Highland Park had a farm community. It also had affluential people here too, even in that era. I mean, Wildwood, which is the first Jewish settlement, in Highland Park, was around 1900. So, so there were the people who came for the summer, and then there's the people who farmed. And in fact, I don't think there's probably very much recipes in there. Nancy and I had this discussion. very likely are there from the people who are working the land.
Mm-hmm.
So that squirrel pie, maybe that was a game changer.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Kathy. And again, she'll be in a breakout room later, so you can pick her brain a little bit more about these recipes or share anything that you've tried similar. But we are now going to bring on our last presenter, Diana Dretske, and I am going to spotlight her. There's Diana. So her final presentation is The Rustic Manor, Good Food, Cocktails, and the American Old West. And Diana is the curator and Lake County historian for the Bessbauer Dunn Museum, so another co-worker of mine. She has researched the history of Northeastern Illinois for over 30 years, published 3 books, including her most recent, The Bonds of War, about the 96th Illinois Infantry in the Civil War, and is the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Illinois State Historical Society for outstanding contributions in promoting, preserving, and commemorating Illinois history. So thank you, Diana, for being here, and we're excited for this last presentation.
Great, thank you. Good evening. So as a historian, I'm interested in the Rustic Manor's place in the county's history, but personally, I was excited to delve into their story because I am one of the thousands of people who enjoyed the restaurant's food and unique woodsy frontier character. When I went to the Rustic Manor, it was in the 1970s and 80s with my parents and grandparents, and it always felt like a special occasion when we went, even if it was just a family dinner out. So any of you who went there will know what I'm talking about. In 1947, Victor and Marian Trybom opened a supper club in Gurnee called the Rustic Manor Restaurant and Cocktail Lounge. It was on the northeast corner of Grand Avenue and Kilbourne Road. Over time, they added to the building and created a sprawling restaurant built of logs sourced in the North Woods of Michigan. The entire Trybom family were involved with running the restaurant. This is going to advance. There we go. The family story begins for us with their emigration to the United States. In the spring of 1882, the Trybom family emigrated from Sweden. This included Olaf and Sarah Trybom, their children Carl and Agnes, and a nephew, Johan Jansen. You can see them listed here on the ship's departure manifest from Sweden at the bottom. They traveled from Gothenburg, Sweden to England, where they boarded the Helvetia to America, and that's the image there of the ship that they were on. They landed in New York Harbor on May 11th, 1882, not Ellis Island. Ellis Island did not open until 1892. Marian Trybom's father, Anton Kotarski, emigrated from Poland in 1896, and her mother, Mary Simonoski, emigrated in 1897. Her parents met and married in Michigan. The Tryboms first settled in Commonwealth, Wisconsin, and in 1887 walked a few miles to Iron River, Michigan, and settled just north of town on Sunset Lake. The family lived on a farm on Sunset Lake from 1887 to 1924, and Victor Trybom was born there in 1895. The family worked the farm and also in logging and mining, which were the 2 big industries there. In 1918, Victor enlisted to fight in World War I. He was assigned to Company A with the 19th Machine Gun Battalion. After the war, he returned home to work on the family farm. Now, during World War I, U.S. farmers increased their food production to feed our European allies. But following the war, prices and the demand dropped, and farmers had an oversupply that they could not sell. So this really caused a double depression for farmers before the actual depression started. This prompted many farm families and children to leave the farm to go to the big cities to work. So that was the case for Victor and some of his siblings. By 1923, Victor was living in Cook County, Illinois, and that's where he married Marian Kotarski. It's possible actually that they knew one another from Michigan, since both their families lived in Iron County, Michigan. As newlyweds, Victor and Marian returned to the Trybom's family farm in Michigan for a few years, and they stayed there into the late 1920s before coming to Lake County, Illinois. So during the Depression era in the 1930s, the Tryboms were living east of Route 41 near Gurnee. Victor was working at the Pacific Steel Boiler Factory as a boiler tester, and the company's logo is shown here on the left, and that was in Waukegan. Marian stayed at home with the children, Marjorie and Marvin, and her brother and sister were also living with them at the time and working in local industries as well. In the early 1940s, Victor and Marian were both working in defense plants at the factories in Waukegan. Victor still at Pacific Steel Boiler Corporation, and Marian was an assembler doing automobile accessories at a factory. Their son Marvin worked at Johns Manville, which was the world's largest producer of asbestos products. And an image of the factory is shown there. After working for over a decade in factories, you can imagine that Victor and Marian Trybom had conversations about their family's future and that they did not want to continue with the physically labor-intensive work. As it happened, in 1946, a property became available in Gurnee that was the answer to their dreams. The U.S. Postmaster of Gurnee, Worthen Kimball, had retired. In addition to his government job, Kimball and his wife used part of their house to run a lunchroom that sat 50 customers. On this aerial photo shown here, you can see the Kimball property on the far left, circled in red, and this would become the site of the Rustic Manor. The long horizontal road is Grand Avenue, or what today we would refer as Old Grand Avenue. At the far right is the interchange of Grand Avenue with US Highway 41, and that interchange was completed in 1937. So these 2 points, the interchange with 41 and the location of the Rustic Manor property, about a mile apart, so very, very close and very accessible. So having the restaurant within a mile access of the highway made for good business. Interestingly, at this time, there was a growing trend of people leaving factory work to open a tavern or restaurant. Independent researcher Al Westerman found a clear pattern in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is just over the border from Lake County, of factory workers in their late 40s and 50s leaving their labor-intensive jobs to open a tavern, just like Marian and Victor. When the Tryboms purchased the Kimball property in January 1947, Victor was 52 years old. It's no wonder he wanted to start a business of his own and leave the factory floor behind. The old postmaster's house became the foundation for the Tryboms' Rustic Manor Supper Club, and they had big dreams for it. The Tryboms' vision for their supper club had deep roots in their childhood memories of Iron River, Michigan, where logging pine trees had been an important industry and where their immigrant parents had settled just 60 years previously. The rustic feeling of their restaurant appears to have been inspired by the frontier of the Upper Peninsula with its forests and black bears, and where it's believed they sourced the pine logs to build the restaurant. And they also likely took inspiration from the popularity of Westerns on radio and TV at the time. When television became popular in the late 1940s and 50s, Westerns set in the American Old West quickly became the most popular shows. Many of these first shows, including Hopalong Cassidy, were geared to children. But in 1955, adult Westerns such as Gunsmoke premiered on prime time. Other notable TV Westerns included my personal favorite, The Lone Ranger. The Rustic Manor, which looked like a frontier outpost, similar to those seen on TV Westerns, was a huge draw for families. Hawthorne Melody Farms Dairy in Libertyville also joined the Western frontier craze. In June 1955, Hopalong Cassidy accepted an invitation to open the dairy's new ranch and frontier town. The farm drew tourists to watch cows being milked in their state-of-the-art milking parlor and enjoyed entertainment such as a petting zoo and the new frontier town. So you can see this trend is actually happening in a lot of places. When visitors arrived at the Rustic Manor, even standing in the parking lot, you immediately felt transported by your surroundings. The log and stone structure and the pine trees planted around the building evoked an atmosphere of something other than northeastern Illinois. One sidewalk took you along a thoughtfully landscaped area, which again took you out of your everyday life into the world of the American frontier. Within a few steps of entering the building, you came to the water wheel with the black bear and the raccoon in the tree, and a waterfall that was so loud you could not have a conversation standing next to it. And I'm sure anyone listening that went to the Rustic Manor would agree with me. It was really a loud waterfall. So after you checked in with the hostess, Edith Missouri, customers, including my family, would throw pennies into the water. And then we would step aside several feet from the waterfall so we could actually talk to each other and wait for our table. Edith Newmar Missouri was the restaurant's hostess for 20 years. And according to her obituary, she was the hostess from about 1966 to 1986. She had immigrated to the US with her parents from Austria in 1927. Here's a view of one of the dining rooms with a stuffed moose head and the heavy rustic wooden tables and chairs and plaid tablecloths. The Chicago Tribune wrote that the Rustic Manor is a beefy kind of place with a pine yard interior and red checked tablecloths. It is also a veritable museum of Americana kitsch, stuff so overwhelmingly déclassé it becomes endearing. Leather horse collars and wooden Indians are in abundance, surrounded by examples of the taxidermist's art, moose heads, stuffed bear cubs, yodeling chipmunks in Swiss hats, some pouring beer or rolling dice. As a kid, I was fascinated by those vignettes of chipmunks and squirrels playing cards. Carol Kleinman, writing for the Chicago Tribune, interviewed Marian Trybom in 1971. And she noted that Marian did all of the artwork, the exhibits, and the dioramas for the restaurant. And she also did the purchasing for their souvenir shop. In addition to Davy Crockett and taxidermy animals, part of the ambiance of the Rustic Manor were representations of Native Americans. These stereotypical misrepresentations of Indigenous people, which included the waitresses dressed in quote-unquote Indian costumes, were common at the time and viewed as acceptable when the restaurant was established. Many of us recall the giant arrow sign and covered wagon, which was parked out front pointing towards the restaurant's entrance. In this aerial view of the restaurant from 1965, you can see, noted by the yellow arrow, the arrow sign with the covered wagon. The sprawling restaurant is just below to the left. I also put on here the Mother Rudd House is below, further left. So it gives you more context. Also note the newly completed Route 132. That's the 2-lane road at the top by the yellow arrow. And this made getting to the Rustic Manor even faster. Here's a close-up of the Rustic Manor's roadside sign. Roadside architecture, such as this large sign, was part of a phenomenon which began in the 1920s and 30s as America's roads were built for traveling by automobile. These roadside attractors were designed to catch the eye of passing motorists and lure them into your establishment, whether it was a gas station, a cheese shop, a motel, or a restaurant. The Rustic Manor's covered wagon became the symbol or icon of the restaurant, and it was closely tied to the theme of the American frontier and westward migration. Images of covered wagons were used on the restaurant's matchbooks, as shown here, and in its advertising. The artwork on this matchbook was likely created by Marian Trybom. Other local roadside attractors you may have encountered in Lake County include the Onan Garage Man, seen in Gurnee and Waukegan, and Paul Bunyan, Bessie the Cow, and the Giant Milk Bottle at Lamb's Farm in Libertyville. So you can see this trend has continued somewhat, but it began early on. The building itself was also an attractor with its handsome pine log siding and stone walls and concrete deer statues. If you look closely in this image, you can see the deer statues against the stone wall on the right, and to the left of the entrance, the deer statues standing. The Rustic Manor was not just a restaurant, but a destination. People from far and wide would go there for the good food and to be entertained by the frontier surroundings and local bands. Supper clubs, such as the Rustic Manor, are noteworthy as family-run restaurants with home-style hospitality. It had the owner and the family on site to take care of you. As part of the family atmosphere, regulars to the Rustic Manor referred to Victor and Marian as Ma and Pa Trybom. Multiple additions to the building eventually created a sprawling restaurant that could seat up to 750 customers. This allowed the Tryboms to host wedding parties, graduation dinners, birthdays, corporate functions, and club meetings. One reader commented on my blog that her grandparents worked at the Lake Bluff Children's Home, and they would bring the kids from the home to Rustic Manor once or twice a year. A good friend of mine, Cliff Suda, who attended Gurnee grade school, which was located just a short walk from the restaurant, said that his class was given a tour of the Rustic Manor, and afterwards they sat in one of the dining rooms and enjoyed ice cream. This New Year's Eve ad from 1949 appeared in the Kenosha News, and it notes the evening's festivities would include an orchestra and that the restaurant would remain open until 2 a.m. Corporations, including SC Johnson Wax in Racine, Wisconsin, hosted employee events here. And tour groups also made dinner stops at the Rustic Manor on their way to concerts in Chicago and Milwaukee. The ad on the right from the Waukesha Daily Freeman notes a trip in 1975 to see Frank Sinatra in concert at the Chicago Stadium with a dinner stop at the Rustic Manor. That sounds like a good trip. And again, here's another matchbook cover with the covered wagon icon. The food at the Rustic Manor always got rave reviews from customers and in newspaper write-ups. On this 1960 menu, the choice large T-bone steak with French fried onion rings was $4.50. Using the inflation calculator today, that would cost you about $45. Each table was served a Lazy Susan with cottage cheese, kidney bean salad, breadsticks, saltine crackers, and butter. And I want to thank my cousin Terry Black for that memory. The Chicago Tribune wrote in 1976 that the Rustic Manor is one restaurant where the first thought isn't prime rib. Here, the feature is baby back ribs for $6, barbecued in a hickory charcoal pit before your eyes. My personal favorite was the poor man's lobster that came with melted butter in a little metal dish with the candle burning underneath it. And I always felt a little guilty being allowed to order it because I thought it was really fancy and really expensive. But, you know, Grandpa always was like that, you know, go ahead, order what you want if that's what you like. Later on, I realized it wasn't actually lobster, it was whitefish. But still, the presentation and the flavor was wonderful, and I just loved it. My 10-year-old self just thought it was really wonderful. These are some of the helpful tips that were printed in the menus and appear to be advice based on past events at the restaurant. We ask your patience, kindly give us sufficient time to properly prepare your food. We reserve the right to seat our patrons. Sounds like people were kind of just coming in and seeing an empty table and sitting down. We regret we cannot be responsible for loss or exchange of personal property. And we are not responsible for accidents. Please keep your children seated. And I would think that would have been pretty easy because the chairs and the tables were really heavy. So you think that once you slide the kid in the chair, they would be seated. But another dining room view is this one from 1950. Just a few years into opening their restaurant, the Tryboms contracted with the Kurt Tyke Postcard Company of Chicago to make a series of postcards. The postcards were sold in the restaurant's gift shop along with other souvenirs. The only postcards I've ever seen of the restaurant are printed by the Kurt Tyke Company. Some other favorites from the menu included a dessert, the banana cream pie, which sold for 75 cents, and for take-home sweets, a loaf of homemade iced cinnamon bread for $1. In 1983, hostess Edith Mazira was quoted in the Chicago Tribune, reminding folks to not miss our champagne brunch on Sundays. It's really great. So you can see just the diversity of what they offered as well. And I really love both this retouched photograph of one of the dining rooms and also this color linen postcard. Here's the 1968 menu with art by Marian Trybom. I especially love this charming scene of the black bear cubs in a tree. I'll give you a moment to peruse the lunch specials. The businessmen's luncheon with the prime rib of beef. Adjusting for inflation, the $1.50 large shrimp cocktail would cost you today almost $13. And the Rustic Manor's $3 steak sandwich special would cost nearly $27 today. So it's always kind of fun to see what things would cost today. Give you just a moment longer to check out this interesting lunch menu. As a supper club, the Rustic Manor served Friday night fish fry and strong cocktails. This classic combination was popular in the 1950s and 60s, pretty typical for a supper club. The lounge area seating shown here included a built-in bench around real trees that later died. And then they replaced them with artificial trees. There was also a live apple tree in the restaurant from the small orchard that had been on the property when the Tryboms bought it from the Kimballs. The standard cocktails at the Rustic Manor were favorites at many supper club and included old fashioned, martini, whiskey sour, and Manhattans, which were a personal favorite of my father and grandfather. My favorite was the Shirley Temple because I was too young to drink alcohol. I love this view of the bar from 1950. It's again a type postcard. The Trybom's son, Marvin, was the bartender in the cocktail lounge. Undoubtedly, this was a pleasant change for him from working with asbestos at Johns Manville. And here's a photograph of their son, Marvin, with his son, with a banana tree that grew in the restaurant for a time. And I don't remember the banana tree. Maybe some of you do and could tell us more about it. The entire Trybom family, including their children and grandchildren, worked at the restaurant when the kids were old enough, of course. And by the early 1980s, Victor and Marian's children, Marvin and Marjorie, were running the restaurant. This seasonal Santa diorama dates to Christmas 1965. It was designed by Marian Trybom. And here's a charming outdoor scene. Many of these vignettes could be seen through the windows from inside the restaurant. And this really continued that immersive experience of being transported to the American frontier. So it wasn't just the outside of the building or the rooms, the way they were decorated, but you could also, again, look out through windows and see more landscape. And you just lost all perception of the outside world when you were there. You really were transported to this place. Due to the restaurant's proximity to the Des Plaines River, over the decades, the restaurant flooded several times, and each time the family cleaned up and kept going. This is a view from 1965 flood. Again, the yellow arrow points to the location where you can see the Rustic Manor there. The Mud Rud House is just a little to the left along the horizontal road, and further still you see the Gurnee Grade School on the lower left. In 1986, the worst flooding in 26 years hit the region. The Des Plaines River was 6.5 feet over flood stage. Damage was so extensive in Lake County that Governor Jim Thompson declared it a state disaster area. The flood forced the evacuation of the Gurnee police and fire stations, and also 17 businesses, including the Rustic Manor, had to close due to the flooding. Shown here are neighboring businesses to the north of where the Rustic Manor was, so you can really get a sense of the depth of the water here by how high up on the cars it is. The Trybom family rallied once again to clean and restore the restaurant, and they reopened on Christmas Day in 1986. At this point, Victor Trybom had passed away in 1981, so it was Marian and the two children that were really running the restaurant. So they reopened on Christmas Day, 1986. Just 2 weeks later, on the morning of January 9th, 1987, the unthinkable happened. A fire gutted the restaurant. 100 firefighters from 24 fire departments in Lake and McHenry counties fought the blaze. The majority of the 100-foot-long building was destroyed. Chief Data of the Gurnee Fire Department noted that the fire caused special problems because the restaurant had been expanded many times over the years, and in some places had 3 roofs. He said the fire was traveling between the roofs, making it extremely difficult to find. These back-to-back disasters with the extreme flood just, a couple of months before, and the fire were heartbreaking for the Trybom family, the local community, and the restaurant's loyal customers. Initially, rebuilding was not allowed because the property was located on a designated floodway. Through the state of Illinois, that designation was changed to floodplain, which would allow them to rebuild the restaurant. However, when they looked at the costs of the new building, it quickly dimmed that possibility, and the building was subsequently razed and the land sold. And you can see on the photograph on the left, in 1989, the demolition going on and the recovery of those items. Eventually, the property was donated to the village of Gurnee, and it was dedicated as the Esper A. Peterson Foundation Park, as shown here in this aerial view. And now there's a trail that goes through that site. It's right across from the Mother Red home, and there's a gazebo there. So you can still visit the property, even though the building is gone. The Rustic Manor really was a reflection of Victor and Marian Trybom's childhood in the pine forest of the Upper Peninsula and their love of nature and traditions. It was also one of the best examples of a supper club and roadside attraction in Lake County. The restaurant evoked the warmth and quirkiness of a traditional supper club and the Trybom family's commitment to quality food, cocktails, and a vibrant environment, which evoked a mythical bygone frontier that attracted customers from near and far. In its 40 years of operation, the Rustic Manor became a landmark, and the Trybom's tradition of good food and hospitality never wavered. Now, it's been 36 years since its closing, but the sentimental longing remains for those lucky enough to have experienced the Rustic Manor. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Diana. I wish I had been around to go there.
I'm sorry you didn't get to.
I know. So I'm just going to do 2 quick questions, and then we'll do our breakout rooms, and I'll explain that. But first question is, where can people find images? Any of those Kirk type postcards, are those available online, or where can they find those images?
Yeah, I do have a blog post about the Rustic Manor on my Lake County History blog. It's not as in-depth as this presentation was, but I do have some of these images there. And also, they're for sale on eBay.
Yeah.
So have at it. You can collect them all.
And then the other question is, was it common for restaurants to, and I'm not sure if you know this one, but was it common for restaurants to decorate or design them themselves, or did restaurants typically hire interior decorators?
Pretty much at this time, it was the family that would do it. People didn't have a lot of extra money. Maybe if they knew someone in the community that could help them with art or something, they would do that. But the Tryboms did this themselves.
Yeah, they're lucky they had a good artist.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you, Diana. So I just did want to thank everyone again for joining us tonight. Encourage you again to look at other calendar of events for the Lake County Forest Preserves. And thank you again for attending our first half of the Lake County History Symposium. And we are already actually planning our next year's symposium, and the theme will be Good Neighbors. So keep on a lookout for that coming up, and we'll probably be asking for presentations early in the fall, late summer. So if you have topics on good neighbors, be in mind for that. I don't know if we lost people. I don't know where Nicole went. I don't see her anymore. Oh, here they all come. I thought I lost you all. All right, so thank you again, everyone, for participating. I don't know if anyone from the breakout room, I was just here by myself. So I don't know if anyone from the breakout rooms wants to share anything or comment on anything, but I think it was hopefully a good discussion.
I did get some more information from my breakout room.
Good.
Yeah, so that was very exciting. So, yeah.
Is this going to be posted in the future? I want to share the images from the Rustic Manor with my brother because we used to go there as kids, and I don't know how I would do that.
Good question. Kathy is the one who I believe is going to be able to post it. Is that right, Kathy? You're on mute, Kathy.
Sorry. Okay, Gail, I'm going to be doing it like in the next day or two, and I'll send you a note.
Oh, great. Okay, no rush. It'll make my brother's brain explode, so I can't wait to show it to him.
Oh, that's the best.
That font, oh my God. And that like bear image, I'm just flashed back to my early childhood with that those menu covers. So thank you so much.
Oh, they were so cute. Hey, Diana, what was the new information you learned, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, so the Balmas sisters were in the breakout room, and they are another local Gurnee family. You may know Balmas florist for years, but her parents volunteered at our museum for years and years, so they were wonderful friends. And anyway, so they said that the image of the Santa in the sleigh, that diorama image, that sleigh belonged to their mother's parents.
Wow.
Yes, and so her mother was Lois Potter, and the Potters are one of the oldest families that settled in Gurnee. So that sleigh goes way back, and they weren't sure how they ended up giving it to Tryboms, but basically said, well, it was a small town and people knew each other, so they let Marian use the sleigh in the diorama. So I'm like, that's wonderful information. Yeah.
Thank you, Diana, for the Rustic Manor presentation. My late parents and I grew up in Niles, Illinois. Okay. So we'd go only for a special occasion. And by the time the Lazy Susan tray, by the time you had eaten at the Lazy Susan tray, or gorged on the Lazy Susan tray, I should say, by the time your meal came, you had to ask for a doggy bag because you were full. Oh, yeah. And then we would go to the gift shop, and everything, of course, was expensive. So to make myself happy, I'd buy an Indian small coin change purse, and then I was happy for a souvenir.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God, yeah. I love that.
Also, I want to make a shout out, Elliot's Pine Log in Skokie, Illinois. That was also on par, the same type of theme restaurant before there were such things as theme restaurants. That was also the Old West and the gift shop, and was also the same thing. But I was very pleased to see your old menus. I actually used to collect old menus, wherever my parents and I would go, and then I got rid of them years ago. And of course, I would get. I'm poking fun here, sick to my stomach looking at the prices, $2.50, for fried chicken. Good luck, right? Yeah. And so I enjoyed seeing your a Rustic Manor listing for the tours, that they were going to go see Frank Sinatra. And then I noticed Waukesha, Wisconsin which, I live in Kenosha now, even though I grew up in Niles, but I didn't know they came from way far in between to these places. I had no idea.
Yeah, it really helped once 41 was put in.
Oh.
People would just zoom really easily back and forth.
Did you
And-
notice Bobby Vinton was listed on the
Oh,
at
yes.
the bottom there by Frank Sinatra?
Yes. Yeah, so yeah, you had a lot of good. I was surprised Frank Sinatra was still performing in 75, but anyways.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us
Thank you.
tonight, and we
Well,
hope
thank
to
you.
see you at the next one
Well,
on
thank
January
you.
19th. Have a great
I'll
evening,
be there.
everyone.
I'll be there with bells
Thank
on.
you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye. Have a good night, everybody. Stay well.
night.
You too.
Thank you.
Good night.
Nicole and Diana, if you guys want to stay on for a minute, I don't know if Kathy already left.
Oh, well, where's Nicole? I wanted to say hello to Nicole. She's still there?
Still here.
Hi, Nicole. It's Holly. How are you, darling?
Good. How are you?
Wonderful. Wonderful to see your grandpa's smiling face behind your left shoulder.
Oh, yes. Yep. Got my background.
He was guiding us. He was guiding us through this whole presentation. I want you to know.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again, hopefully on the 19th.
I'll be there with bells on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.